Good afternoon, everyone. We are now starting the lecture from Professor Derek Beach. I think that I don't need to present him. He's a professor of the University of Aarhus in Denmark. And, well, I think that most of you know about his work on process tracing, on theorizing in small n research, causal small n research, and, well, all other issues related to qualitative research. Professor Derek Beach are going to present a talk about beyond testing, how methods contribute to theory construction. So, Professor, please.
Thank you, and it's very nice to be here. I've had the privilege of teaching some very, very smart, I think, all USP students this week. And I'm usually here for the summer school, so this was also nice to try a bit different. And actually, some of the ideas in this talk I presented last year at the summer school, and I have been working on them since. So in some respects, it's an update on some of the ideas and the challenges. I was also working on an article together with my colleague Glauco, actually about some of these themes and our dissatisfaction with some of the theorization and our knowledge, the usability maybe in particular, of our knowledge in political science. So the first kind of point I would have is I think that theorization per se is very under theorized. We do it all the time, but nobody tells you really how to do it. Often our methods, we have these very advanced research methods and techniques, but really underdeveloped methodologies for this more causal theorization. You could argue maybe some of it's to do with people like Karl Popper, who were talking about, a context of discovery and then real science starts, when we have our testable theory and then we go out and see whether it holds. But that's not actually the way that real research, and in particular interesting questions, are answered, I think. So this kind of stream of work that I've been doing the last couple years, and it's beginning to get to a publishable state in some of the products, is an attempt to develop one pathway or one way that we could use our methods to develop better theories, and in particular more interesting. Often our causal explanations are quite simple, common sense. I have had this experience several times where you talk to a policymaker and they're they almost are kind of the ones that have some kind of political science background. They will not be very surprised at our findings, but they'll think it's really, way too simple. It's not really telling them anything interesting. And of course, it depends upon what kind of specific field you're working with. I've been working the last couple years more in a kind of applied, like development, development and interventions, different types of interventions, and there, our like theoretical knowledge of like what actually works and why does it work the way we think it does, the kind of the theoretical, more abstract knowledge is very poor. And I find that the theories like trying to figure out, okay, what kind of development intervention might I choose in this kind of situation, we really don't have a very good good understanding. Often our explanations are quite case specific, or we'll do something like claiming causation without explaining it. This is an article, and it doesn't get any better in the article. Sorry if anybody knows the authors. This is general. We like to draw like arrows and boxes. Information seeking leads to adoption, which leads to policy change. And when I read something like that, I say, well, yeah, okay, how? I have so many questions. Like, how does this actually work? How do you have somebody seeking information? Why does that lead to an adoption of a policy? And in the article, they don't actually go much beyond that. They kind of say, well, this happens, and then this happens, and then this. But like, why? What is the causal? What is the things that are driving it are not told. So in this article, and I find many examples like this, where like, what are we actually told about policy learning? And it also has methodological implications, because I have no idea what would be relevant evidence for this. I could do some storytelling, but what would be relevant evidence for this? And I think that we have a tendency, like one of my diagnoses of where our kind of usable knowledge, like the knowledge that I'm interested in, is somewhere in between these kind of grand theories, these context-free kind of, international relations, like realist theory, and about a balance of threat. But it's so abstract. You have to do so many steps to actually get to usable knowledge. Or we have very case-specific. This is the problem in my own kind of wheelhouse. Is I do case studies, and I develop, I think, sometimes okay explanations, and maybe a theory for how it works in a particular case. Like, how did the EU, a crisis, produce major reform? But then, okay, great, I've studied how the EU tackled the COVID crisis. Well, what does that tell me? Like, that's a very unique crisis. It's not going to happen again, hopefully, although the energy crisis is getting pretty scary. But it's case-specific knowledge. So how do we get to that kind of mid-range level? And this is something I've increasingly kind of come back to. Of course, we are familiar with the term mid-range theory, but what is a mid-range theory? And actually, I think Merton, back in the 60s, had some really good ideas that we've kind of forgotten. And I think that if we really try to recapture, would really help us. Because again, I think we're in the situation where we often will have either like really grand theories that are very abstract. It might be kind of a one size fits all. We often see these in kind of large N variance based, you say, well, X on average produces Y. Okay, but that's an average. What does that tell me? Or it's often quite case specific knowledge. And this is an example, I think, of from my own kind of wheelhouse on like EU negotiations. And this is, I think it's quite underspecified. Like, so we have a crisis, and then something about the crisis produces this incomplete bargaining that produces kind of half-baked institutions. So the EU countries, they know they have a crisis, they try to fix it, but they kind of end up with something not very good, which doesn't really work, and then creates a new crisis, and then we get in this, they call it the failing forward, right? And this is a quite simple, like a very simple process theory of like how we get from X to a new X. But it's telling us so little about the causal dynamics. Like, how does this actually work? That there was a special issue then of really good scholars looking at this. And when you looked at the empirics of all the different cases that they were then, like in the special issue where they're saying, well, did it work in this case or did it work in this case? And it actually never worked in the same way. Like when they actually were getting down to like the how did it work in cases, it was often actually completely different in a causal sense. So I think something like this is an example of like a theory that could be better. Or, again, we then end up with either very abstract theories or very case-specific, where they're over-specified. And then we sometimes, if we're going to generalize from them or learn something from them, then we overlearn. Like we assume that it's going to work like that in other cases without actually studying. And of course, our theory itself is very case-specific, which means almost per definition, it's the COVID case. So, I mean, the obvious, of course, is, well, we need to move to some kind of mid-range level, but that's where the challenge kicks in, because, like, well, how do we do that? We want to develop contextualized knowledge that would include enough of what Nancy Cartwright would term like the key facts that would enable you to figure out maybe some of the more complexities. Why does this theory work in a different way, in the same cause work in a different way in this kind of context? And I don't think that we have that kind of knowledge. But then how can we get there? Well, one way, and this is, I've been inspired in particular by the work of Nancy Cartwright, is thinking about mid-range like process theories in the form of not just X and Y, but what's going on in between, right? So and there's, I guess there's, if you think about an experiment, for example, often what we're doing, of course, is we have one X that we're varying. And then we see what kind of difference it makes for an outcome. This is often not very usable knowledge, because it's no different than, for example, in medicine, when you do a medical experiment, you're often isolating a treatment, one drug, on, in some sample of a population. Well, the typical patient is often not just on that one drug. Often patients are taking other drugs, but you're testing your theories using methods that are monocausal. Whereas actually what you should be doing is you should say, okay, I'm going to test this drug in like some kind of multifactorial experiment, and which kind of going to the political science, that's actually, if you're going to use experiments, that's actually what we should be doing, is we should be using methods that would capture all that complexity. Well, okay, X varies, and then it might be that this and this and this also, of course, that then just explodes the complexity. I can't even want to think about statistically how many, if we're doing a survey experiment, how many different people we would have to include in this kind of, and I don't think a conjoint experiment is not going to help you capture those kind of interactions necessarily. But you can also do it in a more case-based way of thinking, and that's what I'm going to, as far as how do we develop knowledge that would be, I would say, more usable in the form of, okay, I'm in a particular situation, I want to be actually able to have a good understanding of how this process or how this X might work in a particular type of context, which is also kind of what policymakers often are interested in from us. They don't want to know, okay, if I vary this, they want to know, okay, I have an intervention which actually might have different things, and it's putting into a particular context where it's going to interact with a lot of other factors. How do I know it's going to work? Well, that's what you call a good question. Nancy Cartwright's answer to that question would be, well, you start with theorizing some kind of mid-range process theory, like trying to think about how a given process in maybe one type of case would work. it's a simplification. And what you're doing is you're looking at the causal structure in the form of, in Merton's terms, the functions of different parts of a process, so that you can abstract away the particularities of what behavior people are doing, and through understanding what is it trying to accomplish, like in functional terms. It's detailed enough that it can be wrong empirically and then updated. And it's detailed enough to explain how did it work in this particular context. And in particular, the focus in these kind of theories is on, we say, activities and linkages. And activities and linkages require particular contextual factors. For example, one of the kinds of processes I study is how experts interact with policymakers. Well, obviously, a contextual factor there would be there has to be some type of trust among policymakers of the expertise of these experts. Otherwise, the experts can try and come with their policy recommendations, and it's just going to, the policymakers are not going to listen. And so you could have the same activity being performed in a different context, where you have or do not have that trust, with very different effects. So the process theory would actually, this is Nancy Cartwright's language, by unpacking theoretically and also studying it empirically, we would learn about context in the form of being able to understand the more complex type of causal relations that are actually more usable. Like, okay, in this kind of case, we would expect this would work, but if you have this, if you don't have the trust, well, maybe then you have to do something else. And I think what we're often missing, and in particular from case studies, I get Google Scholar alerts every time somebody cites me, and I see what is being published in process tracing. My diagnosis is we have no cumulative knowledge whatsoever, because people do single case studies. And then we have a case-specific theory that just kind of sits there, and everybody's happy in the form of, the scholar got their article published. Maybe they had a glass of champagne when they got after they finally convinced the reviewer too, they're happy. And what do we learn? Right? Great. So I know a lot about the COVID case. I can bore you to death if you want to hear about it. But does that tell me anything usable? And that's where thinking more in this kind of mid-range, but of course I cannot just assume I do my COVID case that it actually is going to work that way in other cases. So this is where we're working right now as far as a case-based solution is thinking about like processual comparisons and trying to build mid-range theories that would work in particular contexts, and understanding why a theory, Glauco and I have been talking about Duverger's law, for example, why doesn't that work in Canada? Like, what is in the process maybe breaking down or just leading to a very different outcome? But by learning, like going down so basically what you're doing is you're identifying some set of potential cases that you think through comparative, like cross-case analysis, looks relatively similar. You take that population, you select maybe two or more cases for more in-depth, something like process tracing. Again, this is not the only way you could build these kind of theories. This is just one way. But doing something like comparative process tracing, where we're not interested in the case-specific complexities, but what we're trying to capture are those the functional equivalents. Nancy has a great, she's a philosopher of science, and I'm a big fan, but she has a really great metaphor that she often will use about like this kind of functional equivalence. So, for example, she is at the zoo and with her granddaughter, and Nancy's getting tired, so she wants to go home. Okay, well, then she says to her granddaughter, okay, I'll buy you an ice cream on the way out. Okay, that's a bribe, right? And the granddaughter said, yeah, sure, cool. And then they go, right? Then you might be in another situation. Maybe a similar situation, but with another granddaughter that actually doesn't like ice cream. So then you might say, well, we can go to the library afterwards or something else, right? The activity is actually different in the form of, well, you're making a bribe. That's the functional. There's like a functional equivalence in the activity, but the particular activity is different. And what we would be trying to do would be pulling out those kind of the common causal structure of like, here are the things that we think in this kind of process. And by getting so close to your cases in the form of thinking about, like, what are these activities doing, that sheds light on the context that would help us understand it will work like that in this kind of case. Like, what are Nancy Cartwright's language would be supporting factors. And that kind of knowledge would then be the kind of knowledge that would enable us to more confidently say, for example, okay, in the EU, we're in this kind of situation. I haven't studied this case, but I would think it might work like that in this kind of case. Instead of just like a one-size-fits-all, like that failing forward theory, this would be a much more like maybe subtypes of theories. And so how do we abstract away the details? Is focus on functions of action. And I've been working on this. Another author, some policy studies authors have also recently, Capano and others have been trying to update Merton's. And what they're talking about is this, like thinking about a causal structure as the way to develop a theory that gives us an understanding of why something works in a particular context. Would also help us understand maybe why it would not work in another context. So you're theorizing in that respect, your causal structure is kind of like the barriers or challenges. And then activities do things, like people interacting with each other do things. So for example, in some of my cases, I have experts interacting with policymakers to try and get them to recognize that they actually are facing a problem. And that might be the first barrier in a policy process would be, well, how do we get that recognition of a problem? And the particular activities, of course, might be different in different cases. Of course, when I'm talking here with like a mid-range theory, I would probably not have a part of a process related to problem recognition where it's coming from experts. That's probably just simply a different type of getting problem recognition than, for example, if it's, sometimes problem recognition is when a politician goes home to their constituency and just gets screamed at. then it's another type of recognition. So it's functional equivalences in activities within episodes, across different cases. And again, these challenges or barriers. And we're using this as a kind of a scaffold to try and go from the particular case to say, well, in these types of cases, this is the causal structure. This is how we get from A to B. You can think of this as, again, also kind of in like policy intervention terms. In this kind of case, like the knowledge we would want would be, in this type of case, these are the kind of things that you need to do. Like, this is what your intervention has to overcome. Exactly how you will do it. This, for example, identifying recipients of your program might look a bit different depending upon your system. But you would be overcoming a similar challenge. This is what would enable us to say these cases are kind of roughly similar at the causal level. And then, yeah, the causal dynamics, theorizing in simple terms the causal dynamics that are overcoming this barrier. And then so our theory would actually be where I think we're telling us a lot more. So if you think about like this policy learning theory where they were just drawing arrows, what I'm advocating here is a theory where you would typically have a lot more information. You would have a lot more information in particular about like what are people doing and why, and how are we getting actors or policymakers to, for example, recognize a problem. And then you would have 2, 3, 4 part kind of a process theory that then you would, because it's close enough to the cases, you have this focus on activities, you're learning about context or supporting factors that enables you to understand more about, well, this is what could work in these kinds of cases. So again, what I'm advocating here is going back to the title, like better theories through methods. Here I'm saying, well, this kind of method, this kind of comparative process tracing used in this particular way can actually help us get to more interesting theories that actually explain how policy learning works. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's actually more contextualized in a way that provides me with enough information to be able to actually figure out, well, in this kind of case, it should work here. Glauco and I are talking about a metaphor in some respects of like these kind of information. This would be kind of like what a doctor actually would want if they want to, when they have a patient come in. They want information that would enable them to predict, informed prediction. This should work like this in this kind of case. And of course, you wouldn't give the same treatment to very different patients. But we need to understand why different patients are responding differently to our treatments. And I think this method is one of the ways that we can kind of through like this bottom up, this comparative process tracing, this is one of the ways that we can do it. I think I showed this example I was finding, but just as far as like thinking about this functional equivalence, this is one of my favorite examples of course, Socrates and the whole, the Democracia Corinthians. And you could say, well, this is a case specific, right? This has never happened. There is no other case where a football player has played any kind of role in a democratization process. But that was, I think, avoiding a coup, a George Way, I think, or did he cause a coup? I don't remember. And you could say, well, this is a unique. But then you could say, well, is there anything in democratization processes that might be a bit similar? Well, in Chile, for example, we have this organization within the Catholic Church, which was founding this organization. And they were talking not about like democracy and kind of horizontal and all these kind of like Socrates. They were talking about rights and liberties. Right? So it's not quite the same thing, but you could argue it's functional equivalent comparing these two cases. So this is just like one episode of a quite detailed process theory of democratization. But we would then ask ourselves, well, so if we're abstracting away, we're not just we're figuring out what is relevant to abstract away. Well, we can abstract away a football player or the Catholic Church and say, well, what is, in a functional sense, what do they share in common? Well, they're untouchable actors, right? You cannot disappear Socrates. I don't think so, at least. At that time, that was, And you cannot just, make these people from the Catholic Church disappear in the Atacama Desert. Pinochet couldn't do that. So you could say, well, this is kind of like this untouchable actor that's performing the function of these actions are creating a safe space for talking about democracy and accountability. And of course, there's contextual factors that would for example, this process probably is not going to work in China right now, at least, because they have such total domination of public debates that they still have tools for kind of silencing people. So it might be like a contextual factor is that you have some way of getting your message out, which you, at least on the far as I know, China's been pretty successful at preventing that. So this part of a process theory simply wouldn't work in that kind of context. And it's by learning about the activities that it will also shed a light on, well, if you have that total domination through, different media, this is not going to work. Right? So you might get it in another way, but this is not going to work. I think I want to not talk about this. I'm going to jump over this slide because I wanted to just show you an example of and this is a quite simple theory. There's more. The figure itself is actually too simple, but in the article there's more. Okay, it's showing you like how you could use this, and this is an article about together with some health economists about investment in mental health and well-being in workplaces. And so it's a process where we have we have a problem that these companies are facing, and then we actually get to the good outcome of an organization that is a high investor in mental health and well-being. And so we want to understand in this article, what we were trying to do was we were trying to understand how can we get from A to B? How can we get from this problem to an actual successful outcome? And we identified several companies. I didn't do the heavy lifting on this. I'm not going to take credit for that. In particular, the first author, Luke, did the heavy lifting, where we did quite in-depth process tracing case studies of a few companies, trying to figure out like and we had not just one, we had multiple that we could compare and say like, well, it looks like you have these phases, like a phase about getting organizational buy-in, because of course the leader might say, okay, we're going to do this, but if the people in his company are like, oh no, not another kind of training, you don't have any organizational buy-in, you're not going to get to the outcome. The process is going to break down. Right? So we developed through, comparative process tracing this process theory. And of course, then we have, I don't remember in this study, it was maybe 2 or 3 companies. And you could say, well, there's a big difference across different companies, like a large 1,000+ employer or small mom and pop. Mom and pops are not going to have mental health and well-being programs, but relatively small public-private sector, does that matter? We didn't know, right? So we had just like 2 successful cases, and in this article we just kind of stopped there. And there you can say, okay, well, that's kind of pretty case-specific knowledge, right? Yeah, I'm providing a theory that tells you something about how it works, how we get from A to B in a causal sense, and the context where we think it's going to work, but we don't know. So what we then did, and I, in particular, my colleague Harith is brilliant, and thank you for designing that, that we thought, well, how do we go bigger in? Like, how can we actually explore a population or a sample of a population? So we developed a processual survey where we basically developed, so we had the in-depth knowledge from the individual case studies, these couple case studies, and we had ideas about like things that maybe people would answer if, for example, organizational buy-in had actually occurred, and the next process, or the next step, etc. So we then tried to go big, and we did here's some of the questions that we in a survey that we were simply trying to get for each of these parts of the process. And then we did the survey, and here's for the high investors, so the people that actually ended up at the end. And actually we found, and I think this is then we're getting to really interesting knowledge, in the larger population, we actually found that there weren't for this theory, there weren't very many cases that went all the way through. There was a lot of people that started and tried, like got to part 1, part 2, part 3, part 3B, but then we lose a heck of a lot in the process. And then we only end up of these sampled cases, we only end up with 18 that actually went through each of the 4 parts. And of course, then we can use that knowledge to understand, well, something maybe, so these are high investors, actually, they have the outcome. Mm-hmm. But this process is not working like that in most of the cases. Does that mean that our theory's bad? I don't think so. I think that the answer is there's some complexity, there's some other pathways, there's other ways to get from A to B. So what we're trying now to figure out is why these cases are falling away. And what are the differances that would make that you keep on the pathway? And we have, other questions about, socio-demographic kind of questions of like company size, sector, these kind of things that are enabling us then to try and comparison, like, okay, we have these cases that go all the way through, and then we have these cases that fall out. And what are the differences that would then hopefully, at one point, I would actually hope that we get in a situation where we can say, okay, if you have this kind of company, maybe you should, because you score on these contextual conditions, maybe you should try to do this pathway, this one, right? But if you don't have some factor that we're trying to identify, well, okay, we can see that you fall away. Of course, we want to figure out, well, how did you get there instead? But then we would also be able to predict, okay, well, you don't have that factor. Okay, so you get to S3B, but then you have to do something else. And that would actually also be very usable knowledge, I think, for a company is saying, okay, well, you can get all the way there, but because of this characteristic, you don't have this supporting factor, there's something else you should do. So we could give a cookbook, but then say, okay, well, on part 3, instead of using this, you need to do something else because you don't have, good tomatoes or whatever, you need to do something else. And I think that's where we would then be getting into quite usable knowledge. This is, of course, not easy. And here, this is not just like a monocausal. Here, of course, in the theory, we have one X, but we have quite a few different contextual conditions that are impacting how this process plays out in form of like how this actually works. So this is an example, I think, of how we, in theory, and maybe you don't have, how we in theory could get to, I think, quite usable cumulative knowledge. Because then I could actually have informed knowledge about, well, in these kind of cases, it might work like this. And I'm not generalizing from that kind of case to another kind of case because I know I actually have information that tells me that these kind of cases over here, there's simply something different. And if you're over here, you need to do different things. You don't have to do this all yourself. It could be in a form of, cumulative research. But unfortunately, I think that the way that we've designed our case study methods is we're privileging individual studies, and which in that terms are single case studies that don't provide us with kind of linkages to that broader question of like, how does it work in a population, or differences, the complexity in a population. Where I might leave you then, well, it's actually in that respect no different than experiments. I was talking to my class today about this. You can get a single experiment published in a top, APSR or in a top journal. That's actually pretty weird. In medicine, you typically cannot get a single drug, one test and one experiment published in the Lancet. You get your meta-studies published of many experiments that then tell you, well, across these, and of course a huge population, so that you can start doing cluster analysis and figure out, well, in these kind of patients, the drug is going to work. And if you have this kind of patient, you really need to avoid this kind of treatment. But we have, so our experiments, we're kind of doing the same thing. It's like typically a monocausal, and then one study. So it's like a single case study. And there are not a lot of meta-studies in experimental work either. And I would say, I think if we want to start building cumulative knowledge, that is exactly what we need to do. So this is one way you could do it in a case-based way, meta-studies, and there is now some literature on how to do meta-studies also in a more social science setting of experiments. It's actually quite difficult, the methodology, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand it. But anyway, I think that's where I'll end it here, as far as like a suggestion for, and it's still work in progress, of how we can learn, I think, more usable knowledge, developing better theories that tell us more about the world through our methods. Thank you.
Okay, we now can have some questions from the public. Is there one first question? Yeah.
I apologize. I'm not from the field, so I might make some very basic mistakes here. But listening to what you spoke about, I find many similarities with machine learning approaches. Is that true, and has that been exploited in research?
So I'm not in. Well, I think it would have to be, basically, I guess if you're thinking in kind of AI kind of terms, what I would be advocating would be very, very, very supervised. Like, I'm providing a set of parameters along the lines of, okay, we're focusing on these core like functions and the causal structure. I'm not sure how. I mean, I guess the metaphor would work, but I don't see how the machine would be able to do, and especially figuring out the functions. That's also often an interaction with existing theoretical literatures, like, from different fields. But in principle, I guess here we're also talking about learning a lot about a few cases, and that's typically not what, the machine learning would be. And the reason why we often use machine learning is we're trying to make sense of such a large number of cases or empirical material, and trying to find patterns in it. Whereas what I'm talking more about would be kind of like, it's more like kind of a comparative detective. You have two cases that you think are pretty similar, and then you're trying to build like a template of, but to build that theory, you would also have to really know the empirics of the case. So it would be that much more of a bottom up, where I think the machine learning would be much more a bottom or top down, and typically working with a large. So actually, I think some of the ideas about meta studies of experiments, some of those proposals on methodology are actually have certain parameters, but then you would because of the amount of data that is typically required, you would do some kind of machine learning model where you're trying to combine these surveys or the different experiments in a meaningful way. So this is much more of a kind of a bottom up and more qualitative. Yeah.
Thanks.
Is there? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. I have sort of two related questions, one from another. When we're talking about building a cumulative knowledge based upon the development of those mid-level mechanisms, I know that I'm not an expert, of course, in like folklore studies, there's like big indexes of like the fairy tales, where there's like a subtype 501. That's the story of like when a mystical creature does something like that. They have like very like
Which field?
folklore studies. They have like
studies.
yeah, they have like fairy tales like catalogs. Where it's like number 502, like a fairy tale, fairy godmother helps someone do something. Like they have like catalogs of like typical like stereotypes that can be used. Is this like the approach of the field, like building like a corpus of centralized like mechanisms, like general ideas to be applied in each case? Like, and if that's the case, do you see usually when you were talking about the different, like everyone like give different mechanisms to the same problem, is the problem the different mechanisms or different like names for the mechanism or different like terminology for being used at the issues? Like you define like either A, B, C, but when study focus more on B and calls B something, or like changes the name a bit in the nomenclature, is the problem like a language being used in the field, or are too specific mechanisms usually? Thank you.
Okay, maybe the last first. I find a lot of the theories that we work with, people just draw arrows. So it's not a problem of language. It's they're not telling me enough. I want to know, like, how did it actually work? Like, okay, great, you have a persuasion mechanism. Okay, tell me more about persuasion. Like, who's involved? What are the types of activities that would actually achieve persuasion? Like, so I think often we're simply not we're too quick to just draw an arrow, and then kind of assume that there's a relationship. I want to. As an example, I want a new democratic Middle East. I'm going to bomb Iran. How are you going to get there? Like, tell me more about your strategy. So that it would be that kind of, tell me more. Right, and it's also, of course, it's also to do with the causal inferencing, where that's another question, maybe related to. So I think often the problem is that our theories they're simply providing either too much or too little information, and the too little then kind of we don't really learn anything. I think in a cumulative sense, because it's no different than in development aid. They have these, it works, depositories of knowledge. But then they just throw in just like, okay, and they don't even have like the context within which they say, okay, somebody did a field trial of this type of intervention in northern Kenya. It works. And then maybe somebody else found it in rural Bolivia. It works. Okay. Well, you haven't told me anything about, like, okay, well, you think it works, but like, what's the context? And is it going to work like that in all the cases? I don't know. You're not providing me with any information. Or, so that would be the way too abstract, or you have that, the very case specific. That's typically what takes place in policy evaluation, where you have a very detailed, but then what do I learn? You have, okay, great. It worked like that in that case. That's important for the people that were involved in the funder. But Do I learn anything? I'm not sure. The folklore. So I'm actually, well, I'm familiar with like the. So there's somebody like, Joseph Campbell or some of these people that were studying myths and stuff, and developed these kind of templates and different. So like he has this hero kind of story that has like a template of phases and things that are done in the different phases. Okay. Yeah, that's actually kind of what I would be advocating for as a kind of, and if we take Joseph Campbell, I would also advocate for us not being completely wedded to a theory. And so like our functions, like we just assume functions because of our theory. I would, through the comparative process tracing, I would actually want to have empirically testable, because the problem with Joseph Campbell was that he was way too Freudian. And you might agree or disagree, but there's been a lot of critique about his, like, okay, is that actually, like, it's a very Freudian kind of, so it's kind of like he's so wedded to his theory, he's maybe not actually looking at the empirics. And so I think it should be the evidence and the empirics that are speaking. And this would be one way of drawing out of that, all that complexity of the empirical world, some form of more cumulative knowledge. This is one way to do it, I think. Maybe.
Is there any other question? Wow. Okay. Professor, I think that we are done here. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your talk. I think that we all learn a lot. Mm-hmm. And, well, hope to have you back on summer school. Yeah? Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.